Welcome. My name is Keto, and I am a consultant that does a lot of development with lots of different technologies, front end and back end. And I did this presentation actually for the first time at a Code Mash in Ohio in January. And some of the Ionic folks saw it and they thought, hey, maybe you can do it for the webinar. So here I am. So this presentation, some people like the intro. Woohoo! Well, I'll be happy to tell my daughter. This presentation is called Shipping a Web App as a Mobile App. Basically, I'm just going to go through sort of the process of using Capacitor to build out to basically take an existing web application and deploy it as a mobile app. And we actually went through this process for one of our clients recently. So I'll sort of be weaving that narrative throughout the presentation. Before we get too far, I'll just say a little bit about myself. My name is Keto. You can find me at Keto99 on Twitter, and I'm also on Mastodon at Keto99 at Mastodon.social. And you can also find me at ketoman.com. And I've been around in the industry for a long time, at least around 20 years or so. I've spoken at lots of conferences. I was a Google developer expert for web technologies for a while. I'm a member of the Jakarta EE Guardian, so I'm very involved sort of in the Java community and a lot of backend development as well. And I'm the principal consultant at my own company called Virtua, where we do training, consulting, mentoring, architecture, development, all sorts of stuff related to application development, normally for medium, large, small companies and governments, and focusing just on, mostly web application development. Sometimes we do front end, sometimes we do back end, sometimes we do both. But pretty much across the gamut. We do have a heavy emphasis on Java on the back end, though. I'm also a Java champion, and I also am the co-host of a podcast. So if you like podcasts, check it out. Stackedpodcast.com. Basically, we cover front end and back end development. It's me and a few other guys, and we also have a guest on every month or so, I should say. So if you like podcasts, check that out. I'm also working on a new product called Speaker Tracks, which is a tool to help frequent speakers keep track of their sessions, which is something I'm pretty familiar with. So if you're interested in that, you should check it out at speakertracks.com. And I'm actually going to be using sort of a prototype of Speaker Tracks for the demo, just to sort of show how this can work. So that's my story. And I'd like to take a second to get an idea about you guys. If you in the chat could tell me just sort of what your background is, like, do you do web development, native development, and what you're hoping to get out of this session, that would be great. It's always a good idea to get an idea about where the audience is coming from. So if you put anything in the chat, that'll be helpful. All right. Okay, one person says hybrid. One person says 95% web. Okay, 5% PWA, awesome. Someone says they've worked with responsive web apps with Ionic and Angular. Oh, Angular 1, wow, okay. OutSystems, SPA, okay. Hybrid. Web developer front end, primarily React web dev. Okay. Someone's looking for exactly what the topic is, shipping a mobile app. Excellent. Full stack dev for 20 years, now building a capacitor app for Angular. That sounds like me. So welcome, Miko. All right, got native script in here, Ionic hybrid, web development with Vue, Java Kotlin, building first Ionic React app now. Well, this is a great set of people. Wow. Okay. Someone working with Split. All right, Svelte. I can never pronounce that. Ionic angular building with Remit with Electron. Okay, cool. All right, lots of cool stuff there. So I'll tell you this is basically based on my experience. We took a React app, and I'll again talk more about it, but and shipped it as a mobile device. It's available in the app stores now. But my experience on the front end, I've done a lot of Angular and web components. So that's really my bread and butter as well. But what's great about Capacitor and this idea of basically shipping a native wrapper around a mobile app is that you can use any front-end technology you want, which is nice. So let's walk through a few things, and we can take some questions as we go along. Let's see, I think I skipped a slide here. All right. So it's like my slideshow got messed up for this bit here. So what I'm supposed to do is this. Okay, excellent. All right, so this is correct. Okay, so the first question is why bother with mobile? And I think this is a common thing, a common scenario. Mobile, if you have an existing web app and it works and it's good, hopefully, the idea of doing mobile can seem a little daunting. It's a whole new platforms, whole new ball game. And you, of course, do not want to duplicate the effort because, software development is expensive. And, writing a native app can be expensive. And even if you look at React Native, it's basically writing a whole new application. Obviously, you can reuse some logic, but the UI layer is due. So why bother? Well, I think, as much as we try to push the web, and I'm someone who's been doing web development since the inception, basically, I actually wrote CGI bin apps in Java. So we always want to push people towards the web because we get the ability to do the sort of instant deployment. It's a really powerful platform, especially these days. But people still find stuff at the App Store, right? And they still say, where's your app? And one of the big benefits is discoverability, right? So people are in the App Store, they're doing a search for your app, and they can find it. And to me, that's probably one of the biggest benefits because, the client that I worked on this project with, they have an existing web app. It works fine, right? So, but they know people go to the app stores and they search for the client and they try and find them and they can't find them. So think of it as a lot of a way to reserve real estate, expensive real estate, essentially, in the app stores. But then, of course, there's other benefits, right? There are the native features, and the native features are pretty cool, right? And some of them are available on the web. There's a lot of great web standards that expose a lot of these features, but there's still some of them that are better native. And obviously, taking a camera, you can do it at the web level, but you can also do it natively. Wallet passes are one thing. Splash screens, notifications, accessing a file system beyond local storage or session storage. Biometrics, of course, is important. The ability to do social sharing, status bar, all these are native features. And the native integration is really one of the key things that you want to be able to exploit by having a native app. Because you figure if you're going to bother having an app running on, going through the trouble of deploying the App Store, you might as well take advantage of some of those features if you can. So the native features are there as well. And I'll tell you, with this particular client that we went through the process with, they didn't use a lot of these native features, but they used a few, and they are helpful. So of course, like anything, there's just, it's not always perfect, right? So there's pros and cons, right? So the pros are what I mentioned. You have the discoverability, you have the ability to add native features. But the cons are that, now you're suddenly shipping for multiple platforms, right? So as opposed to just worrying about, a handful of web browsers, and which is a lot easier now than it was in the days of IE, right? You can pretty much assume you're using an evergreen browser. You just have to test a few different platforms and a few different browsers, right? But with the App Store, it's actually not so easy because you now have to support two major platforms, right? And both of them have different versions. So now you've got a whole other set of devices you have to test with and make sure it works with. And so that means there's more development, more maintenance. And then if you have to worry about the approval in the App Store and, synchronizing that with whatever you're doing on the back end and all that kind of fun stuff. Because, with a web app, you can deploy the front end and back end at the same time if you want, right? And you don't have to worry about it. But with a mobile app, you have to basically have the backend ready for whenever the app stores approve the app. And so that means that you need to make sure that your backend still works all the time while the old versions of the app are running. And you also need to be able to notify people of a new app if that's something that you want to do. And another thing is this with web apps, you can deploy frequently and often, right? With a mobile app, you cannot, unless you use Ionic product called AppFlow, which allows you to dynamically update the app several times a month. I don't know what the numbers are. I'm sure Ionic can help with that. We ended up not using that. We had a lot of specific requirements to deal with and some internal issues. But if you have an app that you need to update very frequently and you don't want to go through the app stores, then you can use the AppFlow product. But if you don't use the AppFlow product, you have to deal with the normal App Store release cycle, which can be different from what you have on the web. And because you have all these platforms, you have to, of course, do QA. And even though the web app, the behavior is pretty consistent, there's still edge cases. There's still things that behave differently on different platforms. And also, at least on Android, the browser options aren't quite as consistently new as you might expect, because they have a lot of people with older devices. So you have to kind of decide where your cutoffs are and all that kind of fun stuff. So it's not it's not like it's magic. There's work involved, but the good thing is that most of the work is around deploying and testing as opposed to developing lots of new features. Or rewriting your entire code base or anything like that. So it's actually overall pretty cool. Okay, so there's the pros and cons. And I was wondering how many of you remember PhoneGap and Cordova. Anyone just say if they remember, put like a +1 or something? Okay, so one person says, yep. All right, got a few people that remember it. All right. Someone uses Cordova with .NET. Nice. Okay, so the first time we did this app, we actually did it with Cordova. So if you remember Cordova from the very early days, it was pretty much a slow, clunky experience. It got a bad reputation, right? Because the phones weren't as fast, and it you would use a PhoneGap app and you'd be like, oh, this is a PhoneGap app. I can tell it's like kind of like clunky and weird. But it's gotten a lot better. So the browsers are much more powerful. The phones are incredibly powerful. And Cordova is still out there and it still is being maintained. We'll provide links afterwards. I'll make sure Diana has links to the slides and everything, but there's this great article called State of Cordova in 2022, which basically gives you an overview of where Cordova is and sort of where things are going with it and all that kind of stuff. So I encourage you, if you're using Cordova or if you're still wondering about it, you can read this. It's written by one of the committers. So that's a good way to look at it. Now for us, we had done the initial app in Cordova, an older version. Thank you for the teacher comment, Alexandra. So we built the initial version of the app in Cordova, and it was working. It was shipped it was in the app stores. It was fine. And then what happened was the client actually, and that was actually using Angular 1, and the client ended up doing a total rewrite of their front end in React and was like, hey, can you update the app? And we're like, yeah, so we basically want us to redo the entire thing because you have an entirely new code base. But now it's been a few years actually, let's look at Capacitor instead. And so we went down that route. And what's interesting is there are some key differences. So we'll talk about those. Oh, that was a mistake in my slide ordering. Okay, we'll jump to that slide last. So Capacitor is a newer project. It's from Ionic, as you may have guessed. You can find it at capacitorjs.org. There it is. It's got a lovely, I must say that folks at Ionic have very good design chops. So that's kudos to you guys. That is Ionic. Let me go back to my slides here. Okay. And that's Capacitor. So when we're looking for alternatives to Cordova, we ran across Capacitor, and basically Capacitor is billed as sort of a next generation version of Cordova. And the main thing is that it has a more modern design and tool set. And we thought this made a lot of sense. And for us, we just wanted to pick something that was a little more modern. And we wanted to ensure that it could be used for a while because they just rewritten the app. It's going to be in that framework and that platform for a long time. So we wanted something which was more long-term, more forward-facing. So Capacitor looked like a good choice for us. And you'll note that our application does not use any Ionic components, or it's basically built, we did not build the application, our company didn't, but it's built using React, and it uses a lot of custom components for the insurance industry. It's basically uses a very sort of custom React platform for the insurance industry. So it's very, very specific and doesn't use any Ionic tooling or anything. But this was still a great idea for us. So really, one of the key things I want to point out is that although Capacitor is very much an Ionic product, you don't have to be using Ionic tools in order to use it. You can use it with any web app, which is what I'll be showing today. So some of the differences between, okay. All right, I think my audio just went in and out. Can you guys still hear me?
We can hear you. The camera, I think, went off, but we can't hear you.
Okay, thank you.
And you're back.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I just saw a little blip saying my audio and input and output has changed. So, okay. One of the main differences between Capacitor and Cordova is that Capacitor requires that you actually have some idea about what you're doing with the mobile app, which is a different take. What Cordova tried to do was sort of like abstract you from all of the mobile stuff to sort of magically make a mobile app for you. Whereas what Capacitor does is it basically says, okay, well, a lot of that abstraction created a lot of difficulties with customizing things. So what we're going to do is give you an actual Android project and an actual Xcode project, and you have to manage those. Those need to be checked in, source control, just like anything else. But we provide you all the tools to do the deployment to the app stores for you and everything. And what that does is allows you to actually understand what's going on better, which is nice. You can customize things easier. You can write custom native code if you need to. We haven't done that, but we could if you wanted to. And also what I really liked about it is that it's easy to debug. So, I'm a Java developer. I've also done a lot of front-end development. And I haven't really done much Swift or much iOS development, but I have done some. We have, in the past, we inherited a Swift/Objective-C project. So I like to be able to throw a breakpoint in there and be able to go through the plugins if necessary, which is I've actually done. We actually found some bugs in one of the plugins and put a bug request in. So it worked out well. Another key benefit is that it is actually backwards compatible with Cordova, which is awesome. So what you'll find, we found this, that sometimes there's not a Capacitor plugin that does what you want, and most of the time there's actually still a Cordova plugin that does, and the backwards compatibility works extremely well. So in our app, we use a combination of Capacitor and Cordova plugins. Okay, so that's basically the story. Now let's do a quick demo. And what I'm going to do is take an existing application that knows nothing about Capacitor and then turn it into a Capacitor app. And what's amazing is how quickly you can do this. Of course, you probably wouldn't ship it after 20 minutes, but at least you can get the idea. And what I want to do is use a project, use the speaker tracks project. So I mentioned before that I'm working on a product to help speakers keep track of their sessions. So we've got like, part of it done. And what we have is like the front end. And what I'm going to do is just take that project directly from source control and then add capacitor to it. So this is what that project looks like. Switch to the right screen here. All right, and I meant to increase the font size here, so let me do that really quick. Okay. Now, is this big enough for people to see? If anyone can't see it, just let me know in the chat. I'll make it bigger. So this is the project. It's a normal web app. There's nothing special about it. It's got some build stuff in here, but it has a package JSON. It's using a library called lit, which is a library which helps you write web components. So this application is written using custom web components using lit. Doesn't use React, Angular, or anything, but it is written in TypeScript. And what's nice about it is that it doesn't really matter. From the capacitor perspective, as long as you have a bundle or an application, basically a web application, you can have bundles or not, it'll work. So from a development perspective, you can see it's a normal application. It's got a small number of dependencies, basically some lit stuff. It's got source, it's got an index HTML, and it's using rollup for the actual app itself. So it's pretty straightforward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly build the app. Whoops, did not need to do that. So I'm just going to do npm run build. Do that in this window. And it's actually, so there's an example, which is what we'll be looking at. Oh, of course. Need to be in the correct folder. Ignore the cyclic dependencies that's still in development. We haven't rooted those out yet. So, okay. So we've got example public, and we've got stuff in this public folder here. Okay. And what I'm going to do in this window is I'm just going to then just you need to go to the right folder. Okay, so now this is just an ordinary web app that's running. There's nothing special about it, nothing related to mobile. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so this is the app. And it's actually not the right version, of course, because okay, this is the right version. All right. So this is the app. It's not a capacitor app. It's just an ordinary web app. You see it's got a little picture. It's got so there's a question. Are there any print directly to POS printers? There are some print plugins, actually, which we've used. So they do help make your life easier. All right, so it's just a simple web app. It has some links, it has a bio, it has some publications, it has sessions. You can see here's my session here. I can click on it, I can see more stuff. I can see previous presentations, and I can do sorting and filtering and all that kind of stuff. Okay. But for the purposes of this talk, it's just an ordinary web app. Okay. So what I'm going to do is actually take this web app and turn it into a mobile app. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my folder, and I'm going to go back over here and then to my folder. Okay. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to install Capacitor. Whoops, I guess I need to put an I here. Okay, let me see if there are any questions while I'm waiting for this. Are there any capacitor plugins that prevent the app from going to sleep in kiosk mode or similar? I'm not aware of that. I'm really not aware of that. So that's a particular use case I have not run into, but I'd be curious to know if that's the case. That would be interesting. Okay. All right. All right, so that now we've installed it, and next thing we're going to do is install the capacitor CLI. This is, of course, key. Like any good project, there is a handy CLI. There's a keep awake plugin. Nice. So if you look in the chat, there's a link to a capacitor plugin to keep the app awake. Very nice. Okay, so now I've added the CLI, and then I can actually use it, right? So let me do that. Okay, so now I can initialize my project, and I'll just keep the name speaker track. Sounds good to me. And I'll make this virtua.track speaker tracks. Okay. And the asset directory is example, I'm sorry, public, yeah, example/public. Okay, woohoo. All right, so I've created my my app. There's a link telling me where to go next. And let's take a look at the, actually, there's one more thing I want to do. So I've created the app, but I also want to make sure I install both target platforms. And Capacitor also supports Electron apps as well. But I am just doing Android and iOS. So let me do that. Okay, so now we're good. So we've installed Capacitor, we've installed the CLI, we've installed Android and iOS packages. So if I look at my package.json, you can see now I've got Capacitor dependencies as well that have been added, and some development dependencies. Most of these are actually already there, so these are not new. So basically, I've got these new dependencies here for me. So I have dependencies. And now what can I do? Well, the first thing you can do is look and see what actually got generated by the CLI. So all the CLI did was generate this configuration file. You can have this in TypeScript or JSON format. So basically, you can see I've got an app ID, I've got an app name, and I've got the WebDir and the bundled runtime, which is now set to false. And of course, there's more stuff you can put in here. The docs explain every property in detail. And what's nice is that when you use the TypeScript version, you actually get a code completion, which is handy. So you can see there's iOS specific things. There's Cordova configuration. You can put plugin configuration in here as well. But unlike Cordova, there's not a ton of stuff. You can't do everything in here. You still have to go to the native projects to do some things. But it does give you some levers, which is nice. Okay, and one of the things I want to point out is that in this particular example, I'm putting all the capacitor artifacts in the same repo as the web application, which is perfectly fine. A lot of people do that. A lot of examples will do that, but you don't have to. So for our project, we actually don't even touch the actual main repo except for code changes, which we do have some code changes. So you do have some capacitor dependencies in there, but all the mobile stuff, mobile build is a completely separate project, because when you build the project, all Capacitor cares about is where this WebDir is. So as long as it can find that folder, it doesn't really care, which is nice. Okay, so now we've got our package. And we've installed packages. So now we need to actually tell Capacitor to add those particular platforms to our project. So I'm going to do this. npx add Android. Okay, so it's now added the Android platform. Okay, and now we're adding the iOS platform. And of course, I'm running on a Mac, so it's easy for me to do iOS. If you're not on a Mac, you cannot do the iOS stuff. Okay. And what this command does is it basically copies all of the stuff from the main folder, the public in this project, it's example / public folder. It copies everything from there to the actual project for Android and the project for iOS. So that's what that does. So now we should have two actual projects that we can open inside an IDE. So we can open inside of Xcode or Android Studio. Okay. And one person did have a question, can you do a standalone desktop app? And yes, there is an Electron platform you can install. And for that, you can do a desktop app. So you can do that as well. Okay, so I just want to make sure, yep, example public. Okay, so we should have two projects here. So now what we can do is we can actually look at the app running inside of Android. Okay, so there's actually a handy command here. And here, so this nps cap run Android, and voila, there's all these different Android devices. Now, of course, I've been doing this for a while and I already have all these emulators installed. So if you don't have any installed or you only have one, that's what's going to show up here. So I'm just going to pick a Pixel 5, API 30. Okay, so there is a question. When you upgrade a new Xcode version, do you regenerate the app, the native part? And the answer is no. I usually don't regenerate it. I usually just upgrade it. Because really what happens with Capacitor is you usually sort of end up with the project is a real project you should maintain. Now, if you've then made absolutely no changes, you can regenerate it. And usually the changes are pretty minimal. They're only in like a couple different files, like the info.plist file or the Android manifest.xml file. So you probably could regenerate, but usually we don't. Because I like to sort of keep it as more of a static artifact. Okay, so this is that little app we saw running on Android, and voila, look, it actually works. And all I did was just the very simple steps you saw. And of course, this app is already responsive, so it didn't magically make it responsive or anything like that. It was already responsive. It would look the same if you just decrease a viewport when I was looking at it in a regular browser. But here it is. And you can see it's like any other app. This is all running inside of this emulator here. Okay. So there's the app, it's running. And what we can also do, of course, is look at the actual project. So if you were an astute observer and you looked at my left here, you may have noticed there's now an Android folder over here. So I can actually open it very easily by doing this. So one person says, how about plain JS apps, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript without frameworks? And the answer is yes, you can do that as well. This particular app doesn't really have a framework. It has some libraries, but that's it. It doesn't have like React or anything like that. So, okay, so here's my app. I've got an app folder, and then I have some Cordova stuff or some Capacitor stuff here. Okay, so my app has ordinary Android artifacts. You can see it's got my this folder here, and then it's got my own folder, and it has a main activity file, which I've never touched before. Some generated code, and the assets. This is where all of the actual web code is. So all that's is bundled in the assets folder. And then, of course, there's my manifests. And in here, this is basically sort of the deployment descriptor for an Android app, right? So this has all of the basic information about the app. We can see it's got the name here, and it's something you may want to change. The labels, so these are things that you may want to change going down the road. And then other things here, and also permissions. So usually what's going to happen is when you start actually, developing stuff, you're going to be adding permissions here and editing this file. And there's also a file that is the Gradle build, which often you have to edit as well. So you do edit some actual files here. What's nice also is that you can see the actual code. So this is the Capacitor Android code. Okay, so you can actually set breakpoints in here if you want to. And then if there are any plugins, they'll be in here as well. Okay, so there aren't really any plugins that we've added, but plugins will show up here as well. So it's nice you can see the actual code and step through it if you need to. So another question is, how much memory CPU do you need to give your Android emulator for it to perform at a reasonable speed? To be honest, I haven't really checked because whatever the defaults are have been fine for me. Because think of it, remember, like you're only running your app and the images don't have much on them. So unless your app is a huge memory hog, you usually don't have to worry about it. There was one situation that I'm thinking about where I had to make some changes, but that was more for debugging. And I think we made those changes. We increased the heap only for debugging purposes. And we didn't have to, that was not a permanent change. And I don't remember what the numbers were for that. So, okay, so that's basically what things look like in the Android world. So let's go back to the iOS world. I'll go to the iOS world. So we'll do the same thing. On iOS. Okay. And again, we get a whole bunch of different options. This is actually my own iPhone, which it actually is plugged in. That's why it's there. And the difference is that Xcode sort of comes with all of these, so you don't have to install individual emulators, which is nice. So I'm just going to pick like an iPro. Let's see, iPad. Where's iPhone? iPhone 11. That's what we want. Okay, so Mo said he stepped away from his computer and he's wondering if you could respond to the comment about Capacitor with Vanilla.js apps, and the answer is that you can use it with Vanilla.js apps just fine. So it's does not require a framework. Okay. All right, so this is the iPhone simulator. Okay, the images are not showing up for some reason. Okay, but this is the application. The images should be showing up. Let's see if I have an issue going on here. Okay, so I'm not sure why the images aren't showing up, but they should be. But essentially, it's the same idea. You have the app, it has all the same artifacts, it's just running inside of a web view, and I can use all the same features. And this could be, sometimes you'll find like there is a simulator that's a little bit hokey. So what we're going to do is we'll open up the project Xcode. Okay, so now I've got it loaded, and you'll see up here, I can easily pick the app to deploy to. So I'll just go over to one I know I've used before. We'll try it there. Okay. And this is nice for both iOS and Android. Oh, the image is still not there. Okay. to see why that is. Both iOS and Android, you can of course get the console output for the actual app, which is handy. And usually it also includes the output from the JavaScript stuff as well, which is nice. All right, so I'm not sure why this isn't showing the actual images, but it should. So I can't debug that right now, but essentially you get the idea. We can also look at the artifacts that you get, right? So this is, again, that it's an iOS folder inside of the same repo. And it's got the capacitor config, it's got some iOS assets. The info.plist is sort of the main file that you end up editing. And to be honest, I really never use this version. I like to just look at the source code. So info.plist is just another XML file. And when you have to change permissions or other sorts of things, you often will edit this file as well. And other than that, you have the stuff we were talking about before. So you have the different frameworks. And there's iOS stuff. There's Capacitor, Capacitor Cordova, etc. So again, you can go and look at the code and debug it and look and see how it's written, etc. And it's actually very enlightening to just look at the code and see how it's written and how it works, as usual. So that's the iOS side. Now, there's a couple things about the iOS side other than the images, which are a little funky. So you notice that if I scroll up and down here, okay, let me go back. You'll notice that I don't have a lot of space at the top here. My stuff is a little bit cut off by this wonderful little, now they call it dynamic island, but the little, that one's called notch, that's what it is, which is exciting. And there's also a few other things that you end up having to do. And actually, I'm now remembering what the problem is with the images. Okay, so iOS Safari is kind of weird. It's sort of the new IE in a lot of ways. So the web view is based on Safari, and it likes the encoding to be specified. Even though, on the server, you can enforce the coding to be UTF-8, but when you're running on the device, you don't really have that luxury. So you have to explicitly tell the browser. So what I'm going to do here is go over to my source. Actually, I'm going to go to example public. Okay. And in here, I'm going to make a couple changes. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of fix this, the area at the top. Okay. Excuse me. So, okay, so I'm going to put that there and get rid of that. So that'll give me padding at the top of the body. And then I'm going to add this meta tag so that it'll actually handle the encoding properly. So I'm just going to save that. And since this is actually in my public folder, it's already available for me to sync with Capacitor. So I can just do this. And this will copy it into the projects. And then I can go back to Xcode, and then I can just run it again. See if it looks any better here. Okay, it's not looking better. So I'm just not having a good day with iOS, I guess. It does fix another issue with there was an issue with a funky character showing up below, but not a good day for iOS for demos. Okay. So those are some things you have to do for iOS in general, though, the UTF-8 and the this for newer iPhones that have the lovely notch. Okay. All right, so let's do a couple. We're short on time, so let's do one interesting thing here. So if you, we'll look at the Android one because it's a little prettier. Okay, so be nice to actually use a native feature. So we've got it running in the browser. I'm sorry, in the web view, in an actual native app. And now we can actually use some special features, right? So let's say what we want to do is when you click on the icon or the picture of the person, the avatar, you can upload a photo. Okay. And of course, you want to use the native camera features in order to do that. So let's try that out. So the first thing we can do, is we can install the Capacitor camera plugin. So we'll do that. Okay. And of course, we need to run that npx cap sync in order to synchronize it with our projects. Okay, so we're good there. And now what we want to do is actually change the code a bit. So there is this file called speaker. So like I said, this app is TypeScript, but it doesn't have to be TypeScript. It uses web components, but you could use React or Angular or Vue or whatever. And there is a method here called a render headshot. And what this does is just display the HTML for that headshot, right? Very straightforward. And this actually is this URL is returned from, right now it's a static file, but theoretically the backend. What we want to do is change this so that when you click on it, we actually can load the do the Cordova capacitor magic. So I'll replace this with another method. And this is basically the same thing. Let me get Xcode to stop complaining here. Okay. I'm gonna read from disk. It's basically due to the update there. Okay. So what we're going to do is basically now make it so that when you click on it, we call this method. So this is in lit. This is how you specify an event handler for an image. And what we'll do is put this method in here. What this method will do is use the camera plugin to upload a actual image. Okay. Okay. So you can see what we're doing here is there's this global object called Capacitor, which is actually very handy. It has lots of methods. Okay. It is native platform. You can get the actual platform. You can add event listeners. There's a few event listeners that let you know, get notified, like when the app is loaded and things like that. You know, if there's a plugin available, etc. And what you end up doing is in cases like this, where you have to do some switching based on whether or not you're using Capacitor, you end up basically using this object. And of course, you can move the code into other classes, other files, functions, etc. The mobile specific code, or you can just do it sort of inline like this, depends on how you want to do things. We ended up with a mobile utils class that we use a lot. But what this is basically saying is that only if you're on a mobile device, a native platform, and you're of course clicked on this particular item, that what we're going to do is we're going to call this camera plugin, okay? And the camera plugin is defined, well, it's defined up there, but it's been imported. This is the one we just installed. And we're going to get a photo, and you know the camera plugin has some options for how you call it. So you can call it and ask for the quality, whether or not to allow editing. And what this essentially is, it's an interface based on properties that apply to either Android, iOS, or both, right? So whatever plugin you have is going to basically try and wrap the native functionality, and usually try and do it in a way that works for both platforms, unless it's a platform-specific plugin. So for example, we did stuff with that with the Apple Wallet. There's no equivalent Android wallet plugin. I mean, there are some sort of that do similar things, but essentially it's a special thing. It's only for iOS. So in that situation, we'd only check for iOS in this if statement. But basically what we're doing is we're getting the image back from the camera, and then we're just updating it on the page. So in a real application, you would also send it back to the server, but we're not doing that because this is just a demo. So now I've added my code, right? Let's see if I can get this to run on the web. So exactly. So this will just build it, which is, of course, is important. And then this will also bundle it as well and make it available for the web. Okay. So we go back here, we refresh, and I click on here. Lo and behold, nothing happens. And that's what should happen, right? Because we said only do it if the platform is native, right? So it should work exactly the same. So that's good. All right, so now what we can do is we could just try it in iOS, but of course we can't just do that because with iOS and Android, you have to actually specify permissions. So what we need to do is edit the iOS plist and then allow permissions for doing this kind of stuff. So the plist is this lovely file. Okay. And what we're doing is saying we want to be able to use the camera and work with the photo library. Okay. And this is the message that will display to the user. So, all right, so I've added these permissions. So I should be able to do this now. And actually, I did forget one thing. I should do the MPX caption again. Okay. Yeah, let's see what it looks like here. Okay, so someone asked a question and they said Xcode has so many options. There's something that helps us figure out which ones to focus on. And basically, you just look for the ones that are related to what you're doing. You sort of end up finding things along the way. So looks like my build died. I'm guessing I messed up the, I did mess this up. So I put this wrong. So put the wrong place. Yep. Okay. My bad. This, of course, is the problem with actually editing the file, so you can mess it up. That's more like it. Okay, so there's my non-existent headshot. Let's see if it does actually let me do something. So let's pick up something from the photos. Okay, so this is the message that was in the plist, and you see this is that default name, which of course I would change. All right, so there are my default photos on this app. Oh, and there it is. Okay, so now I've very quickly added native features, which is pretty awesome. So this is how it works on iOS. On Android, it's of course a little bit different. So Android, you also need to set permissions. So we'll go to Android Studio. Inside of that app Android manifest XML file, we need to, down here, add these permissions. So we want read external storage and write external storage. So those are the ones we need for this. And then after we've done that, we can build it. And then we can run it. And there's the build down there. Okay. Okay. And the difference you're seeing here. Okay. Let's see if we get this to run. So just to keep things simple, what I'll do is I'll do it for so we've got an error. Okay. Of course, this would be just my luck. So I've got a module error. I'm not really seeing what the issue is here. I'm in the right folder. Okay, that's what the problem is. I was like, wait, what am I doing here? Just need to use the right command. So, you know. So that should be this one. I think this is the same one. Yep. Okay, there we go. So I click on my image and you can see I can take a picture and it gives me this cheesy little fake picture, right? So I'll take my picture and I'll can edit it, which I'm not really going to do. And there it is. Okay. So in the span of like a half an hour, we basically took a normal web app, we turned it into a mobile app, deployed it on 2 different platforms, and then added a native plugin, which is pretty cool. So that's the demo, and that's really the power of Capacitor. Now, obviously, you know, in reality, you will have to do other things. You'll have to do lots of tweaking. And the most important thing is testing, because you'll find edge cases where things work perfectly fine on mobile. I'm sorry, on the web. And then for whatever reason on your particular web app or on a particular platform, they don't work right. We ran into that in a few cases. So it's important to keep that in mind. All right, let me just wrap up because we're pretty much out of time. I did want to mention a few points here. So one feature which is nice is live reload. So you'll notice whenever I made a change to the web app, I had to rebuild the web app and then rebuild the native app, which can take a long time, especially if you've got a web build that takes a long time. So there is a live reload feature. I was never able to get it to work with iOS, although theoretically it should. We were able to get it to work with Android just fine. And I have not, it's one of those things where you spend some time up front trying to get it to work and then you never revisit to figure out, you know, exactly why. So it could be that there's a very simple explanation as to why I couldn't get it to work on iOS. But it is handy. It saves you lots of time because you can just change the artifacts, you know, locally, and they immediately reflect in the app in the simulator that you're testing in. One thing to keep in mind, though, is if you do use live reload, with iOS and Android, really wants you to use HTTPS. So keep that in mind. And then you actually have to create your own certificate and then install it on both devices. And this, last I checked, this wasn't actually mentioned in the Capacitor docs. And it's kind of a pain to do. So keep that in mind, that there's a certain amount of setup time required to get the live reload to work. But then again, once you get it working, it's worth the trouble. So keep that in mind. CORS is, of course, an important thing. If you're making backend call, which you undoubtedly are, you will need to make sure that you have either CORS implemented or that you have a native plugin to do HTTP requests. And that generally tends to be easier because the host name varies depending on whether it's iOS or Android. And if you don't have control over the backend, and in this case, we didn't have much control over the configuration of the backend, doing the plugin request approach is easier because what it allows you to do is bypass CORS altogether. So you basically can make your backend calls. They use the native HTTP stack, which doesn't need CORS, and then they send it back to your JavaScript. So keep that in mind. It is something you have to deal with. Authentication is another big thing. If you're working with an identity provider like Auth0 or Okta or Keycloak or whatever, you know, there's some work that you have to do in order to make all that work. You usually have to pop up another browser window. Ionic does have a plugin to do this, which we ended up not using. There's also different options out there as well. But it is something to keep in mind. It's not going to be magical. It's going to be a decent amount of work to get the authentication to work. Another thing to keep in mind, if you are doing any sort of like outside, you know, integration, like we actually had to integrate with a legacy web app that we popped up in a different browser window, things like that. The custom URI schemes are really handy, and that allows you to, like, you know, for your own application, you can say, I want to be, basically, if there's a URL that starts with this particular prefix, like, you know, my app : / or something, then automatically open my app. And that's very handy when you have like an external website that you're loading in the application, because then you can easily go back to it. So keep that in mind as well. And when it comes to building and deployment, keep in mind that deployment for these apps just means getting it into the App Store. So you've either got to do this manually, or you have to use a tool to do the publishing for you. And we traditionally have done it manually. Ionic has a great tool. I haven't used it, but it looks pretty handy for doing the automatic deployment to the app stores, which it seems like a huge time saver. We ended up not using it for a variety of issues, but it's something to look at if you're taking this route. And the main thing about the Ionic tool is that it lets you do automated updates without redeploying to the app store. So you can basically just update the web assets, which is very handy. So if you're doing lots and lots of updates on the web, something like that is a good idea because it'll save you having to do extra deployments through the app stores. But I do want to remind you that, since it is actually not exactly the same as your web app, in an ideal scenario, you still want to have some native automated tests. This is something we're currently exploring because it's still not exactly the same. And just having a few, at least, basic tests just to make sure that once you've got that production build, that it goes through, even running inside of, iOS or Android, is going to save you a lot of time. So I wanted to point that out as well. Okay. So with that, I'm going to run over to my very last slide here. And this is okay. And if there are any questions, actually, I guess we're out of time, aren't we, Diana? So we don't really have time for questions, but thank you so much for your time. You can find me again at Keto99 on Twitter. My company is virtua.tech. So if you want some more information about what we do, let me know. You can drop me a line there. And of course, Capacitor, you can find at capacitorjs.org. And I want to thank Diana and the folks at Ionic for having me for this talk.